Good morning and welcome to the 29th meeting in 2025 of the Local Government Housing and Planning Committee. Fulton McGregor has joined us online this morning and Evelyn Tweed MSP and Megan Gallagher MSP have given their apologies. The first item on our agenda is to decide whether to take item 4 in private. Are we agreed? We're agreed. Thank you. The next item on our agenda is a roundtable discussion on the Scottish Government's draft climate change plan, and we'll be focusing on the buildings element of the plan as well as the role of local authorities. And we're joined by Dr. Richard Atkins, who's a chartered architect representing the Royal Incorporation of Architects in Scotland, Dr. Jocelyn Fleming, who is the Senior Policy and Public Affairs Officer at the Chartered Institute of Building, Io Hadjicosta, who is from WWF Scotland and today representing the Stop Climate Chaos Coalition, Cornelia Helmke, who is from the University of St Andrews and here today representing the Scottish Research Alliance for Energy, Homes and Livelihoods, Alistair Hill, who is the Head of Energy Transition at Consumer Scotland, Neil Osborne, who is the Service Lead in Climate and Energy at the Highland Council, David Rain, who's the Policy Manager at Homes for Scotland, and Derek Rankin, who's the Head of Policy and Strategy at Built Environment Forum Scotland. And we are joined online by Professor Janet Webb, who's a Professor Fellow in Social and Political Science from Edinburgh University. So I warmly welcome everyone to the meeting. There is no need for you to operate your microphones, and I remind everyone to make sure that our devices are all on silent. So we've agreed to hold this meeting in a roundtable format to encourage a free-flowing conversation on the content of the draft plan. If you'd like to come in on a question or at any point in the conversation, please indicate to myself or the clerk. And we've got about 2 hours for this discussion. We've got quite a lot to get through. So as time goes on, I may need to ask you to make your contributions a bit more succinct. It tends to be what happens. And to come in only where you have something really additional to contribute to the conversation rather than reiterating someone else's point. And if you wish to respond to a point and the conversation moves on too far, you are, of course, welcome to bring that point in when you kind of come back in, but you can also write to us with anything that you don't manage to say in the session. Is there anything else to say on that? Just to colleagues, I would be grateful if you would maybe direct your question, maybe indicate to someone who you're going to direct your question to in the first instance. That would be helpful so that people know who it's coming to first. So I'm going to start with a general question, which I think it would be good to hear from everybody. So I think we'll just go around the room. So Richard, because you're the nearest to me, I'm going to ask you to speak first, and then we'll just go around and finish with Janet online. So I just would be interested to hear in general, your views on the climate change plan and whether you think it will drive progress in reducing emissions and build on the previous climate change plan.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting the RAS to be at the meeting today. The RAS is, as you will know from previous evidence and positions, is very supportive of the government's attempts to address climate change. It's absolutely essential. We declared a climate emergency in 2019, along with many other members of our profession and probably industry as a whole. I think the proposed plan has a lot of merit. It's heading in the right direction. Our concerns would be, does it go far enough and fast enough? And I think, I'm hoping that we don't look back in 10 years' time to decide it didn't. I think part of what we would be looking for from government to a certain extent is more of the statistical information that will give us some level of confidence in terms of the extent that we're going in. There's certainly issues across the industry in terms of width of skills and resources available. But as an incorporation, we support the direction we're going in.
Okay, great. And Jocelyn, from the Chartered Institute of Buildings perspective.
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity to give evidence today. I think I would reiterate the point about the merit that we see in the plan. We certainly feel it's well-intentioned. The construction sector is a very willing and able partner in trying to help Scotland realise our joint climate change objectives. That said, I think we have some very real concerns about the particular approach outlined in the plan, and what I would suggest could be a much more holistic view, not only of this particular plan, but where it fits into a wider policy landscape relating to construction, housing, and the built environment more broadly. I think we all agree that we want to decarbonize our built environment, but we equally want to ensure that that built environment, and particularly Scotland's homes, are safe. They're well maintained. We're avoiding rates of fuel poverty, increased damp and mold, and I think there are changes that could be made meaningfully to this plan to help ensure that there aren't unintended consequences to what is a well-intentioned piece of legislation.
Okay. Great. Well, hopefully as we get into the conversation, we can get some more of that detail. Io.
Thank you for inviting Stop Climate Chaos Scotland to participate in this discussion. I'll start off with kind of the overall ambition to decarbonise buildings by 2045, which is 5 years ahead of the UK-wide target to decarbonise, which on paper is bold and progressive, but in practice is structurally misaligned with the UK CCC in its scale and timing, and the timing of action that's required. So without urgent action to introduce robust mechanisms with both incentives and regulatory levers, I believe, and we believe, that the climate change plan in its current form is set up for failure, and that's partly because it creates a cliff edge scenario where progress is perhaps modest in the first decade, followed by an unrealistic expectation of near total decarbonisation in the final decade, and that highlights why we need to front-load that investment and front-load that action and ambition in this first decade.
Okay, great. Thank you. Cornelia.
Thank you as well for inviting me. I welcome two aspects, particularly in the draft climate change plan. One is the emphasis that we have to link fuel poverty reductions with emission reduction targets. One doesn't go without the other. Also that there is a technological neutral approach to decarbonizing the building sector, I think is a positive. We can't have one solution that fits all, and it needs to be context specific. However, there's visibly a huge emphasis on heat pump installation, widespread heat pump rollout, heat networks, as well as retrofitting. And these are all very sensible in densely populated areas that are well connected infrastructurally, but as soon as we go a bit more rural, a bit more north, into the outer remote areas of the grid, we have high grid constraints, we have high fuel poverty levels and low capacities, low skill levels to actually address those technological changes, old building structures that are also under heritage sometimes, and all these issues. So there's no particular emphasis on how these structurally more remote locations and population groups can be put forward in the whole just transition, and how can they be active partners in the just transition. Great. So that's one of the main.
Great, thanks very much for picking up the rural and lower density challenges that we face. Alistair.
Thanks again for inviting Consumer Scotland to contribute to this session. I think Consumer Scotland is generally supportive of the contents of the plan. We welcome particularly the focus on supporting consumers to transition to cleaner home heating. I think from our perspective, one of the most important elements of the climate change plan is that consumers are enabled to play a part in reducing Scotland's emissions. I think being active participants rather than, I think for me, for this to be transition to be successful, this can't be seen as something that's done to consumers. They have to be active participants in the transition. I think in terms of what's missing and what we'd like to see more of is a bit more about how we're going to talk to consumers about what's coming next. A number of years ago, I attended a session of the Clean Heat Edinburgh Forum and listened to Edinburgh City Council talk about their ambitious plans for heat networks. And I was blown away, having worked in the sector for 10 years or engaged with heat networks for about 10 years. And throughout the kind of presentation, I was blown away by the ambition and plans for the next 10, 15 years. And it occurred to me that actually they've not spoken to a single consumer about this, like they hadn't actually thought about the people that are going to be on the heat network. And so what I'd probably like to see from the plan is a bit more of a focus on how we're going to prep consumers for what's coming next. If we start to engage consumers and talk to them right now, then it means in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, when we ask them the question about how they're going to decarbonise their home or what choices they're going to make, they're more informed about the decisions and the choices, the implications and the benefits of whatever choice they choose to heat their home.
Thanks very much for that. I think that's a really good point. Neil, from the perspective of Highland Council, where you've got the urban density, but you've also got that remote rural population that Cornelia talked about.
Yeah, and I think from the Highland Council's perspective, we fully recognise that the scale of the challenge ahead, but we also recognise the opportunity to both improve the quality and affordability of homes in the Highlands. And I think the climate change plan starts to set out the pace that this needs to be delivered at, but don't feel that the enabling conditions are fully set out in it yet. I think we still see some of the fundamental barriers are consistent, the short-term annual funding cycles, limited and under-resourced supply chain, especially in rural areas of Scotland. I think the regulatory landscape within the plan allows too many exemptions, especially in rural properties, and that makes it difficult for us to meet the standards as we go forward. I think there's also the rural uplift. I think we've got areas in Highlands, like Wick and Thurso, that currently would be classed as urban settlements. And the reality of working in these areas, they're as rural as some of our smaller communities around the West Coast, and there is a challenge in terms of how we deliver in these areas.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. David.
Thank you for having Homes for Scotland speak today. Our Homes for Scotland members understand, respect and support the Scottish Government's commitment to make Scotland net zero by 2045, and I'm pleased to say that our home builder members are now actively delivering on the new build heat standard, which will see a new built home see carbon emissions reduced by 75% compared to a 1990s home. In terms of the plan, there's two key areas that we would like it to see it go further. We would like to see a full and sustained marketing campaign that helps educate and supports the public to understand the costs and benefits of the move to net zero. And we also believe that there is scope for the establishment of a Scottish Future Homes Hub where the sector and the government can collaborate and partner, look at the innovation and the pathway that we can develop in order to make further improvements to new build homes and reach that target of net zero by 2045.
Okay. Great, thanks very much. And Derek.
My thanks to the committee for the opportunity to participate on behalf of Built Environment Forum Scotland this morning. So with respect to the Buildings Annex, the plan in particular, we welcome the recognition that transformational change is needed to make significant progress in addressing climate change. It's also good that there's the highlighting of multiple strategies that relate to improving building conditions and how they might complement each other as part of a route map for the next 15 years. But to echo some of the other panellists, so one key point is that the main focus on the Buildings Annex main focus on decarbonising heat in buildings is too narrow. So we've spent much of this year consulting with our members and stakeholders and producing a manifesto for the built environment, and the central theme is a call to go further and faster in responding to the climate emergency and achieving net zero as part of a whole systems approach across policy portfolios. So for our members, transformational change requires a scaling up of investment and action across a wide range of areas, including training and skills, tenement repair and maintenance, retrofit project delivery, heritage grant programmes, bringing vacant buildings back into use, data and research and more. So none of this is easy, of course, but our members in varied built environment specialisms across the country, they report that we're just going too slow in areas like retrofit, progress is patchy. Transformational change identified in the plan needs a holistic whole systems policy approach if we're to deliver it.
Great, thanks very much. And Jan, I'm going to come to you.
Thank you, and thank you again for the invitation to speak. Apologies for joining remotely, but I have a respiratory infection which I'll spare you all from.
Thank you.
The draft plan, obviously it's really welcome to see this and to see the ambition in the plan, but I am quite, I have to say, and I would say my colleagues too, are somewhat disappointed by the lack of actual specific actions for implementation in the building sector annex. I mean, we have, going back for 15 years now commitments to this kind of action through, in 2015, for instance, making energy efficiency of buildings an infrastructure priority, through an earlier version of a heat in building strategy and so on. But in the draft plan, we are still seeing a commitment to a heat in building strategy by the end of 2026. And of course, no reference to what has already been consulted on, the Heat in Buildings Bill. And so I fear that although there is clearly ambition, and it's fantastic to see that ambition, that we will not move forward at the pace that we need to move forward, commensurate with our climate protection goals, if we don't put much more by way of action commitments into the final version of this plan. And I think we know the challenges of working across the building sector because we have done lots of piloting of that work. And yes, it is challenging, but it needs to be done. We need to take the public with us far more. I was concerned to see that there isn't a comprehensive, as yet, public engagement strategy. There is, for instance, no reference in the Buildings Annex to what was the National Public Energy Agency for Scotland, which became Heat and Energy Efficiency Scotland, and has not had great visibility since then. I think it's not just about engaging people as consumers, it is that very important word, people as citizens who need to be responsible for a share of the action. I'll stop there at the moment, but thank you.
Brilliant. Great. Thank you very much for that. So I'm just going to deepen a little bit because some of you have already touched on the target for decarbonising heat systems by 2045 and also started to touch in on kind of policies that are there or lack of policies. So I'd be interested to hear, and now we're not going to go around, so please just indicate who wants to come in on this initially. I think I'm just going to allow you to offer yourself up here. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on whether we've got the policies in place that are the policies and the proposals in the plan. And I think one thing I would be interested to hear about in particular is this long awaited for heat and buildings bill that's we don't, as a committee, we're wondering when it's going to come. And I want to understand what, if that doesn't come, what's missing, what are we losing? We already had a kind of considerable part of it removed anyway. So do we really need that bill in order to drive forward the change that you're all talking about? And I also really heard the piece, so kind of from that initial go around, kind of heard the bit around the need for a more holistic approach. And I also heard the need for the kind of public engagement and engaging with consumers. But yeah, anything in the kind of policy space, I'd love to hear your thoughts more deeply on that. David.
Thank you, Ariane. My recollection of the plan is that there's one simple mention of the marketing campaign, Let's Do Net Zero, and it's one of the bases that we believe that the full and sustained marketing campaign is needed. We see from our experience of the introduction of the new build heat standard and improved fabric standards in new build homes that there is always a requirement to educate and help consumers understand the homes that they're moving into and to learn how to use both the new technology, the ventilation systems, and help them understand how to maintain those properties into the future. Mm-hmm. Public is broadly generally cautious of these changes with things like air source heat pumps. It's a very different way of heating our homes than you might be used to if you're using a gas boiler. And so that's one of the reasons that we emphasise that need to partner with the public, educate them. And it's also why we also suggest for the future direction for new build homes that the work to gain further reductions in carbon emissions from our new build homes is done through a Scottish Future Homes Hub. That's to ensure that policy is deliverable and that it is developed based on the innovation that home builders, whether they're RSLs, whether PSEs or SMEs, are already conducting across Scotland.
Okay, great, thanks. Io.
Professor Janet already made some reference to the fact that there wasn't a direct kind of naming of the Heat Buildings Bill, but elements that were proposed in that bill were actually part of the plan, and in its description, things like connection of non-domestic properties to heat networks and minimum energy efficiency standards, things like that. And those are important, but as far as they are in regulation, right? So There's a few things as to why there was a delay with introducing that as we understand it. So upgrading heating systems and improving insulation must be affordable and accessible to all, which is why it needs to be carefully considered in terms of the balance between carrots and sticks. And a key enabler and one piece of the puzzle for this was kind of reforming the electricity market across Great Britain. And that was part of the consideration the Scottish Government was given and why it was so tied to the Warm Homes Plan in the UK Government and so on. But rebalancing our gas to electricity pricing is only one part of the puzzle, and it's not the only solution. There's a lot of tools that are kind of unexplored in that space, including kind of continuous financial support, ongoing grant and loan schemes that can be provided to both few poor and able to pay households, and also just really exploring the alternative financial mechanisms that could be deployed to really unlock private investment, like partnerships with the private sector. So those are some of the things that could be looked into. So it lacks currently in its form, the draft plan, it lacks a direct mention of carrots and sticks with timelines and clear mechanisms in place. And in this case, carrots would be sustained grants, low-cost finance, working with UK government to reform electricity and gas prices, and sticks would be those regulatory triggers that we were awaiting the Heat and Buildings Bill to introduce, to actually give the workforce, give businesses and consumers the kind of certainty and the kind of commitment that that transition is going to happen in a just and fair way.
Okay, just kind of digging a little bit deeper around the continuous grant and loan support. So my sense is, and I think somebody said it already this morning, there's quite a strong focus around air source heat pumps. I think it was Cornelia. Do we need the government to move into a more of a technology neutral, like have that grant and loan support system, but more technology neutral? If I can come back to you, and then I'm going to come to Jocelyn, who's indicated she wants to come in, and then Cornelia.
So me first?
I think I was going to come back to EO just briefly on that, and then Jocelyn, then Cornelia. Then.
The focus on heat pumps is so, I guess, common or frequent in the sense that it delivers significant emissions reductions as a technology. It's mature, it's proven, it's seen in European countries, and it's already delivering. Especially when we look at the Highlands and Islands region, it's often seen as actually heat pumps don't operate in rural areas, when the facts, if you look at the microgeneration certification scheme tracker, which shows where heat pumps have been installed all across Scotland, you'll see that Highlands and Islands is actually performing quite strong, maybe even the strongest in terms of the installation rate of heat pumps. So we know it works, we know it delivers, and it's also a lot more efficient than gas boilers. One of the tricky things about heat pumps was the upfront cost of changing a heating system from what used to be oil and gas to now the heat pumps. That's going to require some changes, but obviously when you come to the end of the natural kind of replacement cycle of the heat pump, eventually it will be much cheaper as well. It's the kind of transition that we saw when we were transitioning from coal now from oil and gas to heat pumps. So we definitely need the grant and loan schemes on offer at the moment, and they're doing wonders. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you. Jocelyn.
Thank you. If it's okay, I'll come in on both of those points,
Yes.
if that's all right. In terms of the sort of policy landscape, I would echo Professor Webb's point in terms of the sort of lightness on delivery that I think that the climate change plan has. We were equally concerned about the heat and buildings bill and strategy when it was first published in terms of being, I would argue, quite focused on clean heat and generation first approaches to retrofit and decarbonization. I think that the challenge that I have with the plan in terms of it being light on delivery is also its sort of lack of connectivity with other policy areas at the moment. This, for the built environment and those of us working in construction and housing, this is a crowded policy landscape. There's quite a lot of new regulations coming across the plate. There's a lot of moving pieces. And I think my challenge is a lot of what's being outlined in the climate change plan is positive and it is of merit. But it fails to sort of take into account what the impact of those proposals would be on other areas of policy and certainly of the built environment. In terms of being technology neutral, I don't think that even goes far enough. I think it needs to be sort of approach neutral to allow what makes sense for a particular property to go first, very much in terms of a fabric first approach and energy efficiency upgrades, in addition to considering heating systems. I understand decarbonization comes much more quickly if you're going forward with a clean heating system, but that doesn't consider the sort of impact on the well-being of tenants, impact on the quality of our built environment, impact on the safety of homes. I think it's really important when we're working in what is a relatively resource-strapped environment. We know we're going to need public and private finance, that we do this first time right, as opposed to going forward with heat systems. And the CIOB did a piece of research on social housing retrofit and previous grant models foregrounded heat pumps. So we had housing associations that were putting in heat pumps to energy inefficient homes. And then when they were with great intention using their own budgets to come back and improve the quality of the actual structure of the home, the heat pumps are now too big for what's a reduced load. So not only does it not help improve the quality of the homes that we have, nor their affordability to heat if we're not changing the way that electricity pricing is being governed. But I think it also then misuses or certainly doesn't efficiently use the limited resources that we have. I think my other challenge in the way that the climate change plan is laid out is in terms of skills. So we know that we need about 5,000 more people in the construction sector every year between 2024 and 2029, according to CITB. That's not just heat pump installers. It's really important that we do include green skills and upskilling people that are going to be installing clean heat systems. But if they're installing them into a house that's in disrepair, that's not much good in terms of ensuring that people of Scotland have good quality homes. So my take when I was reading the plan was sort of going, traditional building skills are green building skills. We need to have a built environment that is future-proofed. And if it's in a poor state of repair, which we know quite a lot of the pre-1919 homes in Scotland are, we're sort of failing to deliver on what is the intention behind this policy, which is good quality homes for everybody that are also decarbonized and energy efficient. So I think the challenge that I have in terms of not only technology neutral, but in really concentrating on clean heating rather than the quality and sort of energy efficiency of homes is that seems to have dripped into the approach to skills funding as well. And then that skills funding isn't considering the wider skills and apprenticeship landscape in construction. I think we need to think very carefully about Scotland has a housing emergency and a shortage of housing supply. We know that we need to improve our building stock for many reasons. We're not really considering where this piece fits into the wider puzzle and where it might actually hinder Scottish Government's objectives in other policy portfolios. So I think I co-authored a report with Professor Duncan McLennan for the David Hume Institute, which is a slightly different hat to the one on the name tag in front of me today. But I think one of our policy asks in that report, which was about the housing system in Scotland, was for non-housing departments to create impact statements on what the outcome of their policy proposals are on other parts of the sort of landscape in Scotland. And I think that might be useful here when we're thinking forward, what is the possible impact on the skills landscape in Scotland, on the housing landscape in Scotland, and certainly on climate, not only from this plan, but other pieces of legislation. Okay. So I think that's our broad concern is not only the approach, but the lack of joined up approach across the sort of policy landscape for construction in the built environment at this point.
Thanks very much. We're gonna focus a bit more on skills after we kind of get into the kind of policy area, but absolutely connected, right? You can't deliver the policy without the skills. Cornelia, come on in.
I can reiterate what Jocelyn just said. A neutral approach would be good in general because each council, each community has specific capacities that they can rely on, resources they work with, and many initiatives already in place, which are very grounded in local community and neighborhood activism. And those are currently not sufficiently seen, not sufficiently recognized and supported we tend to focus on one technology that then is the promising thing for the future, and we have to apply top-down everywhere without really considering what is actually on the ground already happening, what is actually their possibilities. So we are not against a certain technology, it's just be open-minded and have a decentral approach. And part and parcel of that is, of course, making councils able to fully engage confidently in these conversations, in having local community interests known and also in mind when being in partnership with industry or when communicating with higher level governance levels, and to be able to have a planning certainty. Two things that come to mind that have been raised by our partners and local councils is funding gives capacity, but without capacity you can't get the funding. So it's kind of a circle that you can't get the funding if you don't have the capacity, but without the funding you can't build the capacity. Yeah. Then there's a lack of exchange. Like people, there are so many projects going on, they make mistakes, they learn, they continue, but there's no coordinated way to learn from this, like a shared data repository where people can feed in and learn lessons and exchange their knowledges more widely. So it's not everybody needs to make the same mistakes. And then having planning certainty. So with a lack of the heat and building strategy now, it's really difficult for actors to actually know what they are required in the next years and to fully certainty plan ahead. And there could be phased approaches to phased minimum energy performances, for example, over the next years, but just that councils and industry know what they're expected and that everybody has to pull the same strength, and it's not just maybe if you are willing, if you're happy, we guide you towards.
Okay, great. So so that's kind of a helpful idea, the idea that the plan could indicate when it comes back from its draft form, a phased approach so that people have that kind of sense of certainty. I've got a few people who've indicated they wanted to come in. I've got Jan. We're going to go to Jan online, then Richard, then Neil.
Thank you. If I wanted to, first I think we should acknowledge the huge challenge of this as a policy area. It is very challenging. Every person in Scotland is implicated because we all live in or use or own buildings in one form and another. So it does really need a structured, phased, I would certainly agree with phased approach. I would say we have done an awful lot of the groundwork by way of piloting, certainly through local authority area-based schemes. And what I really would want to argue against is a continued one consumer choice at a time solution. Too much, if you like. I don't want to say voluntarism, but I'll say it. Too much based on, if I choose to upgrade my house and put in an electric heat pump, that's kind of still very much up to me. And at the moment, there isn't an obvious motivation for doing that. We have a very well-established gas industry. For most of us in Scotland, and most of the buildings that need to switch to clean heating systems, we're already connected to the gas grid. It works. It has high safety standards. It's reliable. Most people are very satisfied with it. Now, obviously, all those powers over gas are reserved to the Westminster government, and that's a challenge. But unless we are clear with all of those who are on the gas grid and using gas central heating for heating hot water indeed and cooking often, we're not going to be able to make this transition. Now, we've seen a transition similar to the one we're trying to make in the past through the methane gas grid development, which was very effective. That was incredibly carefully planned, structured engagement over the course of that transition. Very rapidly, most buildings connected up for heating to gas central heating systems. So we could do it again, but I would argue, therefore, that we need that a much more systematic area-based approach, and that one of the key resources we already have in place are our local heat and energy efficiency strategies, which every local authority in Scotland was required to develop, which has provided a much better, more robust database. Now, obviously, it's also revealed all the problems with the data and the challenges of that, but it has given us a direction of travel, and I would be very sorry if all of that groundwork was not now built on and developed into a systematic programme, including taking that whole systems approach that we've mentioned and looking at how we make this the most cost-effective process possible. And doing buildings, we know from engineering data, from lots of different sources, a one building at a time approach is probably the most expensive way all round. It's expensive for the property owner, but it's also expensive for all of us as consumers of electricity, because what we would be doing, for instance, if we rely on individual heat pumps, which is very challenging in Scotland, we have 40% of tenements and flats. Are we really saying we're going to hang an individual air source heat pump off the back of all of those tenement flats? So it needs that kind of much more structured, planned approach with the engagement side, with the public engagement that is needed to go with that. And we can then cut the costs. Apart from anything else, in the Energy Efficient Scotland plans, originally we had a commitment to making an offer to every building owner. Now, taking my own position as an example, okay, I'm an established homeowner in Scotland, in Edinburgh, great privileged position to be in. I would really welcome that kind of area-based approach. So do the trade side, because it gives them a means of planning their work. It should also help to reduce the cost of doing up each house and doing the whole house retrofit. It should also allow us to think more holistically about how we minimise the risks of overbuilding electricity network infrastructure, because if we go one building at a time, given the peaks and troughs in demand for heating, what we will see is that we have to build out huge amounts of reserve electricity generation potential and grid potential in order to meet a few winter peaks in demand. Now, that doesn't make a great deal of sense. At the same time, we've got something like a third of renewable electricity generation is now connected to our lower voltage distribution networks. That's almost happened without planning, but it has happened, and we can now take advantage of that by balancing our systems, our energy systems, more regionally and locally. We've got the beginnings in place through Ofgem's proposals and NESO proposals for regional energy strategic plans. And what we can do in that process is say, right, building on the LHEs, the best solutions in this area are heat networks, because we can use a lot of that renewable power to charge and manage electrically powered heat networks with thermal stores. That cuts the requirement for battery storage on electricity grids, much more cost effective. We can also offer an area-based scheme for retrofit and upgrade of all properties where heat pumps on a building-by-building basis are going in, because we know that that area is not really going to work for heat networks because the load's not sufficient, and so on. So it's that much more planned, systematic approach, which would also give all of us, I think, as property owners, whether it's landlords or homeowners or public building owners, confidence in how we're going to get from where we are now to where we need to be in line with our net zero targets. Thank you.
Very much for that. Richard.
Thank you. I'm going to build on some of the points that I think Jan has just made and others around the table. I am one of those people that has installed an air source heat pump in my farm cottage. And I have to say I'm very pleased with it. I've seen a two-thirds drop in the energy use, one-third in fuel costs had fuel not gone up. Of course, that was in a context, as Jocelyn's pointed out, of a building which I had improved the fabric considerably over the period of time. It wouldn't work without that. And hopefully in the fortunate position of knowing how to do that with a historic and traditional building, which I think we'll come on to. And I'm a very small case in point. As the point has been made, the the industry needs to have the certainty of a forward business plan to invest in the skills and the training that's needed to roll that out, and indeed material manufacturers as well. But of course, that's just one particular isolated case. As has been pointed out, it's not necessarily the solution in urban areas where we have pepper-potted ownership, which results in huge missed opportunities, as has been outlined, where co-owners are either reluctant or unable to come together to look on a sort of tenement-based wide improvement plan, or indeed the local authorities potentially don't have sufficient powers and sufficient regulatory structure to be able to step in and make something happen in terms of both the fabric improvement and then appropriate technologies. And I agree we should be technology neutral, much as I like my air source heat pump. It works for me. So there's a lot of additional work that's required. Like I say, I agree about being technology neutral, but I think actually we have to recognise that these are design interventions in the built environment. And a design intervention brings with it significant consequences, starting, I speak obviously as an architect, starting with the client, with their needs, their well-being, and we've touched on it, issues such as health and well-being, educational outcomes, things like that. The quality of their built environment is absolutely intrinsic to those things. But that design process also takes into account what are, firstly, the fabric first approaches that we should be taking, and looking at those materials, for example, which come with a low toxic, low embodied carbon footprint. There's no point having a built environment with zero emissions if we have just slabbered it with high emissions materials. And then looking at what the appropriate technologies are. And that is very much a case-by-case basis. There's part of me that says technically this is not actually that difficult, because this is what we do. But there's the other part of me, and the RIS recognises that in terms of putting in place that appropriate structure and then building an industry in scale that can deliver it, those are tough tasks. But you know, do nothing is not an option. We have to do this.
Okay, great, thanks. And then I'm going to come over to Neil. And Neil, Richard just said something about local authorities not having the sufficient powers to deliver on what we're talking about. So if you want to highlight that, it would be great to hear what you think.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that point. I mean, I think we've done over the last 18 months 2 place-based projects, and we've used some of the worst housing stock in Highland. So it was the old Swedish timber. It was properties that would be exempt under this if it was left to local authorities to deliver, because they wouldn't see that investment as being practical. The ability to bring public sector funding alongside private sector funding allowed us to build out that project. But the biggest challenge we have is that we've got properties in that mix that haven't been retrofitted because they have the ability to opt out. Most of that opt-outs were actually in either social housing or local or private landlord. So it's that the homeowners were willing to go with us on it, but the social housing was the most difficult to actually move across and actually do the retrofit across the whole scheme. So we need to be able to move away from that. I mean, if we're going to look at this as an area-based approach, which is the only way you're going to drive costs down in this. I mean, it's significant in terms of what we were able to deliver in these schemes rather than looking at a single house across the area. So it's how we move on that side of it. And I think El Hayes, we talked about, we've been a huge advocate of it. I think it's allowed us to build up a real understanding of the housing stock in Highland. But the delivery plan side of it, it's a 5-year delivery plan that they ask us to produce, but we're still working on 1-year funding.
Right.
You can't build out a 5-year plan if you're basing everything on an annual funding stream that you don't know what's coming. And I think on the area-based scheme at the moment, we're quite lucky. I control the private housing as well as the social housing in terms of the funding that's coming through. Area-based at the moment, with our engagement, I've got a 3-year waiting list based on the funding that we get on an annual basis. And we're full for that 3 years. I mean, I could spend that 5 times over on an annual basis just on the level of engagement that we're getting with communities. I think from our perspective, the engagement is good, but I think the messaging needs to be clearer. And it's not just from a national level, I think from a local level as well. Our property team, I mean, they're one of my biggest arguments because their approach would always be heating first. They want to go in and put heating in because that's an easy win for them in terms of development. Fabric first, we need to get that message across that that's the process that we need to work through. And I think certainly from the Highland perspective, you're looking at heat networks. I mean, we're doing a lot of work with Scottish Heat Network Unit at the moment around Inverness. So we've got feasibility worked up on 3 separate networks that basically encompasses the city. But their approach is still very much the housing's almost secondary. And to get the housing side changed across, we need to find a way to reduce the cost of energy into that heat network. And that's the biggest challenge. I mean, we're living in a region that's one of the highest producers of renewable energy, yet we've got the highest energy cost. And there's no mechanism for us to be able to utilise that energy locally at the moment. Now, we know that it's going through grid reform at the moment, and there's probably opportunities that we can start to utilise. But it's very difficult. I mean, Inverness has not got any direct connections, so being able to use renewables directly is going to be difficult. But when we get out to the smaller communities, the level of energy that they need, it's not viable for them to have direct connections. So it needs fundamental change in how we look at the energy market, and certainly in rural Scotland as to how you're going to deliver this at scale.
Okay. The committee, I'm just trying to walk a fine line here because we're here to talk about the climate change plan and buildings, but of course it goes into the whole heat and buildings bit. But the committee went to waste energy to heat project recently, and I just and also last week the research team here in the Parliament held a panel on that, a breakfast session, and we heard from Glasgow City Council talking about how they might tap into the Clyde. Are you looking at things like that in Inverness?
Yeah, so I mean, waste heat is probably our most advantageous tool that we've got in terms of delivering at low-cost heat. But it's not going to be enough. We're still going to have to subsidise that, and it's how we build that out. And that's the piece of work we're doing at the moment, is understanding how we can drive that unit cost down within a heat network. And that's where you really start to understand how you can build it out at scale. Because if we can't compete with the gas price in an area like Inverness, you're not going to get connections at the kind of scale that you need to drive that networks forward.
Yeah. Okay, and the phased approach that both Jan and I think it was Jocelyn have talked about, would that help the council if that was laid out in the plan, that there was like, by this point we need this and so on and so forth? Would that help councils?
Yeah, as long as we're tighter on the exemptions. I mean, if they've got an exemption that they can say that that property is not viable, it makes it impossible. And I think there's still, certainly within the council, there's a view that new build is going to be the answer. It's not. I mean, at the moment, the Highland Council is talking about 24,000 new builds that we need just to keep pace with the demand. Now, you can't write off existing properties at that kind of scale. I mean, it doesn't work. They haven't got a model for doing that, so we need to build retrofit alongside it. But the scale of retrofit in Highland, I mean, through LHEs, we've done a lot of work on it. So we've got 87,000 properties in Highland that needs intervention.
Wow.
And the total cost on the interventions that's been identified so far is 3.2 billion if you're looking at the current rates.
Okay.
I mean, that's the kind of level we're talking about in a region like Highland.
So we really need that certainty built into the plan so that you've got that opportunity for private finance to come in and partner with you. And also I'm hearing the whole piece around not allowing opting out and exemptions and getting tighter on that. Yeah, great. Jocelyn, you indicated you want to come back in.
And then I'll be very quick.
And then I'm going to bring in Willie Coffey and we're going to deepen into skills and workforce.
Then I will leave the skills piece out for now, just in terms of to sort of reiterate or add an evidence base to the area-based arguments that have been made. We did a piece of research again with housing associations that were saying the year-by-year funding that they have access to through the Social Housing Net Zero Fund, that's a huge barrier to them being able to roll out projects that are practical and pragmatic and based on need. So just to say, we would completely support the notion of area-based, not by 10-year schemes in terms of the way that we're approaching retrofit. When I was speaking to contractors as part of that research, they were saying not only can you can bring down the cost considerably because they can share sites, they can share materials, in particular in Highland and Island communities, sharing materials across a larger project makes the costs of moving those materials much, much less. But it's also really good, and I know that we're coming on to skills, but if you've got a larger project across a particular region or area, it also allows the sector to sort of build in local supply chains for skills as well, in a way that if you're sort of doing one house here and one house here, you're not going to bring on new people or train new people. But if you know there's sustained work in a particular region, then SMEs that are a big part of our sector in Scotland are going to be more inclined to bring on new people.
Great. Thanks very much for that. Willie, do you want to take us deeper into that world of skills and workforce?
Well, thanks very much, Convener. Good morning, everybody. I was wondering if I could, though, reverse my two questions. I've got one on skills and workforce that we want to come to, but I feel as though I want to go back to the start to look at the whole consumer participation in this great process and maybe start with Alistair. Do you think that the community at large, consumers at large, are embracing this transition? I don't think they are in the numbers that we need to see. And there are a number of things that have to happen, I think, to crank it up, to make it go faster, that a few colleagues have mentioned today. One is the price of electricity, which is 4 times the price of gas. If we don't solve that, we're going nowhere, are we? We really have to solve that. As well as the grant and assistance schemes are great, but are they enough to achieve that transition on its own in the funding and financial models? And Neil, you made mention to these issues during your contribution there. So I wonder if we could ask colleagues for their view. I mean, Neil, you said we've got 87,000 properties that need intervention and it's going to cost £3 billion. So do you think we need to do much more to really kickstart this and to get the acceleration that we all hope for? Because I've been hearing this conversation at the committee for a wee while now. I wonder if I could maybe start with Alistair.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, I would. Are consumers embracing it? I mean, we did some research about a year ago which looked at consumers' understanding and engagement in net zero. And what they basically told us was that they agree there's a climate crisis, they agree that the action needs to be taken, they agree that government and industry both have a role in addressing that, but also they agree that consumers themselves have a role and need to take action. I think one of the key things that they told us in that research was that they weren't clear on what specific action they had to take to do that. And I think it probably leads into Jocelyn's point about the kind of lack of emphasis and focus on delivery and how we're actually going to do this. And I think what we really need, whether it's for the plan or whether it's for the heating buildings the public engagement strategy, I'm not sure, but I think what we need is consumers need clear direction in terms of what action they can take. I mean, reform of EPC is going to be I think a helpful change. I think it will helpful to deliver kind of more targeted actions that consumers can take for their specific homes. Yeah, you mentioned the HES grant and loan scheme, and we've looked into that as well. And what consumers basically told us is the advice side of that, the HES advice service, they were very positive about that and really saw that as a really strong starting point to get the information they needed. But actually they wanted more. They wanted more detailed information about their property, and that's where they found installers were actually a more useful source of support and information. But the actual HES grant and loan scheme themselves, well, incredibly effective, well, a very important measure, and the envy of other parts of the UK. It's probably the actual consumer journey through HES probably needs to be a much smoother transition, much smoother journey. I'm currently going through that process myself, and it's been quite an eye-opening experience. I think in terms of the things I thought were going to be a barrier were actually really easy, and the things I thought were going to be really easy ended up being a bit of a hindrance. So I know that HES are making iterative changes to that, which I think are very much welcomed, and they certainly listened to their feedback following our research. But I think probably more needs to be done to make that journey through the not just the Home Energy Scotland grant and loan scheme, but just the transition from from inception to installation, a much easier and seamless process.
Richard wants to come in, and I just want to say I've gone through the process and I 100% agree with you, Alistair, in terms of that smoother journey, and much better communication needs to happen.
Thank you. Well, I agree with the point as well, but I just wanted to make the point that there are all organisations out there that are doing this currently on a sort of fairly small voluntary scale, and we can provide after the meeting, we can follow up with details of those organisations. So it is doable, but I absolutely agree the size of the challenge, and that segues into the skills and training. And the other key thing is that advice at some point tends to segue into design advice, which has all sorts of connotations about whether whether the people providing it are covered by PI insurance and that sort of thing. But it also needs to be independent of manufacturers and material suppliers, because we've seen previous initiatives which have been tied into the suppliers in a hope of building an economy of scale, but they've led people down the wrong path, and we've seen that with recent examples down south with moisture in buildings from external wall insulation, etc., etc.
Okay, great. Got quite a flurry of people indicating they want to come in now. Okay, so I'm going to say, so I've got Cornelia, Jocelyn, Jan, Eo, and David. And I think at this point we've kind of opened the doors a little bit to the skills. I feel like the skills also wants to come in too, Willie. So let's just, okay, so Cornelia.
Yeah, okay, a few points. First, the energy prices are, of course, hovering over everything, and that's kind of the big elephant there. But also the energy regulation, the electricity grid regulation at the moment, that doesn't allow curtailed energy operators to distribute or store energy on the grid. Like Orkney is one of the biggest problems, of course, is the energy grid constraint. Since 2012, they are curtailed and they're not allowed to put a battery there to get the energy that they have extra on the turbines that they can't use, not stored or used or distributed locally. So that is completely against what the just transition is trying to achieve, right? So that needs also to be addressed. And then community engagement. I think at the moment the approach to community engagement is more it's a means to the end, that we somehow get to a project approval and make everyone happy. While I think, or we also have seen that in our research, that communities would like to see their participation as being the means in themselves, the ends means in themselves, sorry. And to have a more long-term, consistent engagement rather than there's an investment or initiative now, you need to look at this now, you need to have this information now, but more a long-term conversation. And then we get to funding, how to get councils or other actors to have this capacity to do such engagements. And this funding mechanisms so far have been rather fluent and changing. So again, the certainty and security is lacking for actors to actually say, we have this period, this funding, and we can have a period of trial and error and see and learn and continue without the project being stopped when the trial an error occurred, to build on lessons learned and to exchange this knowledge more widely with all participants and actors. And I think also, especially in those challenging rural areas like the Scottish Islands, people want to see a future for their communities. And when they disagree with net zero strategies because they need to restore the peatland or they need to retrofit the house that they can't afford, then that is not a statement against we don't want net zero, don't agree with decarbonization. It's just a matter of we are not heard. Our strategy was what we want are not reconsidered in this whole strategy. So that needs to be overcome. We need to put those interests first and foremost and then see how it can lead us to the just transition.
So specifically, because we're trying to scrutinise the climate change plan, the draft plan, specifically there you would want to see some more indication around the funding mechanisms. I'm hearing like a period of time where there's going to be funding that might then make people move towards addressing some of that delivery rather and that action.
As it reads at the moment, the draft seems like we do so much, we just continue to do that. Right. And we are on the right path, and that's especially in terms of funding mechanisms in place. And I think of CARES now as well, that was really important for communities to have their own projects running. But they have noted that there's now a tendency to more individualized small-scale project rather than more ownership projects where community actually take ownership over the future of their energy and building stock. So this has not been sufficient so far, so why just continue doing the same?
Okay, great. So just going to a few things, because this is a great conversation. We've already eaten into an hour of our time. We're not through. We're still in kind of the question 3-4 area, or the kind of theme 3 or 4 area. So I'm going to ask everyone to keep their responses more succinct, although it's tremendous everything that you've contributed so far. And also if you can kind of really pull it back to what you want to see changed in the climate change plan, because that's going to be the most constructive things we can then report back to the government and say, we had this incredible conversation with people who really know what they're talking about, and this is what they think needs to be changed in the plan. So just a little tweak there. So Jocelyn, Jan, then Eo, and David.
Great, thank you. Just to pick up on Willie Coffey's point about consumers and sort of awareness, the CIOB did a consumer survey of adults in Scotland, and we found that 39% of the people that were interviewed had never heard of any of the available energy efficiency upgrade grants. So just to reiterate that, yes, I think there is absolutely an awareness piece in terms of people being just even aware of that there is help there and what those programs and models look like. I think the other thing that came out of that survey was that 19% indicated that understanding how to go about retrofit and energy efficiency upgrades was a barrier to them being able to do it. So 1 in 5 people are sort of saying the primary barrier is that they don't know how. Funding, by the way, was the #1 barrier across everybody, which I'm sure will not come as a surprise. In terms of sort of to your point, convener, about bringing it back to the climate change plan, it's an adjacent piece of legislation, but I think one that fits nicely within this plan and discussion, and the sort of interaction between the two should be really carefully considered by this committee and others, is the heat and energy efficiency technical suitability assessments. So the Chartered Institute of Building are really quite welcoming of the proposals for HEATSs in Scotland. We think it would be a really good tool to support homeowners in understanding their specific, the needs of their homes and buildings. But that was quite a heavily caveated degree of support. So we think these could be a really good tool to reiterate Richard's point about independence and the sort of separateness that advice must be trusted and unbiased. So we think that those are good proposals, and this could be a really good tool to sort of try to help focus on the delivery of the climate change plan. I think that is something that the Scottish Government is already working on, is already in train, and could be a meaningful way of taking some of what is a sort of heavily vision-based document and start to focus in on some of the delivery. But again, that comes with the really strong caveats about thinking about the sort of systems that support those HEATSs. Do we have enough people to do them? Are they appropriately trained? We've argued no, not at this point, but they probably could be with the right bolt-on training. So I think there are good proposals that exist in other pockets of Scottish Parliament, Scottish Government at the moment, but I think that's the one thing that we would really like to see in terms of supporting consumers to make the right choice, and also sort of making sure that we've got standardized tools across the construction sector, so that then once these works are identified, and we have a report that we can work on and start to take some action here. So.
Okay, great. So that's you pulling through that whole need for holistic policy, landscape, everything connected. Jan.
Great, thank you. Just saying microphones on mute. So yeah, on the consumer point, we all wear different hats, if you like. We all have multiple identities. We are not just consumers, we're also parents, we're carers, and so on and so on. If we emphasise the consumer identity, we emphasise a focus on the price tag up front in the short term. We need to take that more holistic approach to get people engaged in understanding why we all need to act to install, well, first of all, to save, to waste zero energy in our buildings, in our houses, and that needs to be very clearly and ambitiously in the draft, in the final version of the plan. One way to do that is to help people through a much more concerted public engagement strategy orchestrated across different levels of government. It has to be, and with an advice service that is fully independent of the industry so that people will trust it, and with proper consumer protections in place for the work that needs to be done. At present, we are relying on building owners, homeowners, let's say, to do everything themselves pretty much, to be quite complex project managers in many instances. And many people, well, apart from not being aware necessarily of the need to do that, are not really able to take that kind of project management challenge on board, or not able to afford a project manager to do all of that for them. So it's on the consumer issue, and I would again emphasise the value of engaging with a citizenship identity as well, and of our citizens' responsibilities to be part of this. The majority of the public want to be part of something that is meaningful. The willing will come along willingly. So, and the rest will be, hauled along with a few sticks, etc. eventually. But on the skills side, yes, we need massive upskilling across our supply chains. Yes, of course. But one of the areas that I wanted to emphasise beyond that is the skills in our local authorities. So local government are critical partners in this plan, and yet are under-resourced and need the expertise to be able to take on those responsibilities. I can give you one quick example, one thumbnail example from some research we did a few years ago. We looked at the local authorities across Britain which had ELENA government, European Local Energy Network Assistance funding. And we found that, and that was to build local energy teams, where they could employ a team of people to work over a period of 3 to 5 years. They had to show the multiples of investment. What they could show was that for every €1,000,000 that went in, 37 million euros came back in investment in local energy resources, assets, people and skills. So that was a big, leverage, if you like to use that word, in terms of a quite small public investment building much bigger private and public combined investments in clean energy. We need to see that through, for instance, the National Wealth Fund, through the Scottish National Investment Bank, that kind of regeneration funding applied to this task. It's very useful in terms of jobs, but also skills and expertise and prosperity. Thank you.
Okay, so that's maybe something that you'd like to see this National Wealth Fund from SNIB kind of spelled out in a plan, like how we're going to finance this kind of longer term, and that idea of local energy teams. Thanks. We're going to go to Io and then David.
I apologise for the scramble. That's going to be my thoughts in this, but I'll try and be succinct. So obviously a big chunk of our statutory carbon budgets is on buildings, around 20% per carbon budget period. So there's a heavy reliance and a duty to decarbonise buildings, and the scale of the challenge, as well as the need to act, are undoubtable. So we often talk about the cost of action, of delivering this transition, but we dismiss that the costs of inaction far outweigh those costs of acting. So I'm going to now go back to that point around electricity and gas pricing, and maybe that point around waiting for the reform, the rebalancing of gas and electricity prices to happen before acting. So we already know that a well-installed heat pump can already deliver similar running costs to a gas boiler. But we also know that if the electricity and gas price system was reformed, we would be seeing many more kind of savings that would outweigh the upfront costs in time over the lifetime of the heat pump. So it's undoubtable that electricity and gas price reform is going to deliver benefits, but we can't wait. We've got so many opportunities to tie our own ends here in Scotland with the devolved powers that we do have. So customer journey is, that Alistair mentioned, is part of it with the HES, and local authorities undoubtedly need the multi-year funding to deliver that. But there's also the public awareness campaign that we mentioned, and the opportunity to really highlight the health and economic benefits of the transition, but also just awareness about the grant and loan schemes that are already available that could encourage consumers to kind of jump on that bus. That's not a metaphor. And lastly, just around a network of one-stop shops, a network of hubs that could really deliver tailored advice for homeowners that could work alongside the HES to kind of support consumers and across this kind of journey. So there's things within our power that we can do now here in Scotland.
Okay, great, thanks. And certainly the Existing Homes Alliance has been talking about that one-stop shop idea and the need for that hand-holding, and I think that speaks to some of the things that Jocelyn was talking about in that survey about people not understanding what they need to do as the first step. So, yeah, we need that probably. David.
Thank you. Just to go back to Willie's question about our consumers embracing renewable heating systems, but also improved fabric, inevitably those consumers who are purchasing a new build home will go into that transaction knowing that the running costs of a new build home is about half that of existing stock. And that's a major benefit because about 98% of new build homes are an EPC B or above. There is a small gap of an issue for the likes of first-time buyers or the buyers that are in rural areas or marginal areas where the costs of a heat pump, they don't attract grant that we've discussed heavily today from government, and so the cost of a heat pump is about £8,000 per property, and inevitably that is either added to the cost of the property, or if it can't be reflected in land values and affects viability, the homes aren't built. So there's the decisions that are made by builders, which is, are they passed on to consumers, or the homes simply not built if there's viability issues? Now, we do know that in the lending sector, so amongst mortgage providers, increasingly mortgage providers are offering higher loan-to-values for new build properties in their awareness that actually the higher energy efficiency of those homes, they're willing to lend on those homes because it greens their mortgage book. And it's an important consideration both, I think, for existing stock and new build stock that there is the lending sector out there has obviously got a huge influence in how to support this and also deal with some of the costs. But inevitably, for a first-time buyer or a rural purchaser in a marginal area, if the cost of building the home or the works is higher than the home is going to be valued at, there's decisions that need to be made about whether or not the home's built or whether or not that market can afford that home. And we think that there should be, particularly for first-time buyers and for starter homes or those marginal areas, if it can step back and take that bigger picture of the housing emergency, we need more homes, particularly in rural areas, is the support that can be delivered to help ensure that more of those smaller homes can be delivered for first-time buyers and in rural areas.
Okay, thanks. Neil.
Yeah, just picking up on Willie's points. I mean, I think if you want to accelerate this, the quickest way is to streamline the funding. I think you speak to consumers, we deal predominantly in the fuel poverty bracket. Most of them don't believe they qualify for funding in the first place. They find the landscape exceptionally difficult to navigate. Most of them would give up if they weren't helped through that process. And that's an issue in terms of how you deliver that. But if you look at the skills side of it, from a region like Highland, I think if you're looking at the retrofit market at the moment, it's predominantly driven by the Energy Obligation Fund. So it's the energy obligation providers that are driving this. The large contractors that are buying into it and skilling up are looking at the volume side of being able to secure from that funding. There's not a single contractor in the north of Scotland qualifies with any of the energy obligation funds to be able to secure funding because they aren't at the scale to do it. Wow. So from a Highland perspective, for us to bring in eco-funding, and it's a vital part of the work we do, I'm using contractors from the Central Belt to be able to deliver it. And in some of the skill sets, especially if you're looking at the installation side of it, we haven't got a single contractor in Highland that's qualified to do that work. And it's purely because there's no market for it if they aren't able to secure this funding.
And also the scale, potentially, is what I'm hearing as well, right? If there's a bigger scale, then there could be a market. And that's where that could be driven through local authorities. And it's not just from that side of funding. I mean, you've got other funding streams you need to start looking at. And at the moment, we're speaking to SSE with the transmission work they're doing. They have community funding put aside. They've got an element of that that's been directed towards fuel poverty and retrofit.
none of it was taken up in their last round of funding.
Really?
The community groups couldn't work out how to do it, yet they won't let public sector bid into it and work with communities to do it because their perception is that the community funding has to be driven through community groups. Now, that could accelerate a lot of work if you can start to pool this funding together.
Okay, just to clarify, so SSE has a pot of funding that they just want to focus on community driving rather than local authorities. Yeah, so it's an okay. So maybe that's a message to SSE that they need to be a bit more open there. Richard, you wanted to come in briefly. I just want to also say we are going to have to really start to keep our responses to much more succinct, or we're going to go over a bit of time, but we'll negotiate that at some point.
Well,
Richard.
Thank you very much. I'll certainly be as brief as I can. I was just going to come back on David's point and welcome the fact that new housing is meeting Band B and has embraced the net zero direct emissions. However, I think it's worth perhaps reminding everyone that most new houses are extra houses. They're not replacing houses. The current demolition rates, if you look at the 8 non-COVID years over the last decade, they run at 1,300 units a year. We have 2.72 million homes. So that's a replacement time of 2 millennia. I mean, it's absolutely huge. And by 2045, we will only have demolished 1% of the existing housing stock. So it's great that new housing is meeting Band B, but actually I would argue that they need to be energy positive, which would then give new homeowners effectively zero energy bills, and it would also help in their requirement if they move towards electric vehicles. Suburban housing development relies on vehicle transport, and we haven't talked about transport, but transport, which is a big energy user, is simply moving from one building to another, basically. If we're going to do that in terms of electric, then, again, that's an additional cost, and in both financial and environmental. So I think I would like to see new housing becoming energy positive.
And potentially with your point about transport, which is such a good point, right? Because we've had to focus on this chapter on buildings, but it is absolutely all interconnected. And your point about transport, I think that touches on our work in this committee on the National Planning Framework 4 and the idea of more local living, 20-minute neighbourhoods, maybe in urban settings, but local living.
Yep.
And how do we think about kind of community? It's also thinking a bit about what are the local amenities, isn't it? It's about where's the community hub within a housing development, a new build set out, where are people going to meet and come together so they don't have to think about getting into a car to go somewhere, to have that social cohesion and connection.
Absolutely. I mean, traditional tenement design is, in terms of its form factor, which is it relates to its external envelope, it is potentially extremely efficient from an energy point of view. And as you rightly say, it leads people to live within a 20-minute walkable environment where they don't need a private car. And they can rely on public transport much more. So all of these things are interconnected. And back to the question about what would we like to see in the plan going forward, and it may not sit directly in the plan, but would be a commitment to looking at development modules which are intrinsically efficient through not just place making, but place mending.
That's very nice. Place mending. Okay, that's the new one for me for this morning. Willie, if it's okay, I'm going to move on and bring in some other themes. And folks, if you do want to come back in on skills, I think maybe we didn't bottom that all completely, but I'm going to bring in Alexander Stewart with a connection to skills as well around the just transition.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for your comments so far. We've touched on this in some of your responses, but it would be maybe good to just open things up slightly when it comes to how the climate change plan can ensure that there is a just transition, but also how can it stimulate employment opportunities? Because we've already heard that we seem to have a skills gap in some areas. We seem to have funding gaps, and the amount of resource that's required to ensure that stimulation isn't necessarily there. But what could we do to ensure that would be the case? And maybe if I come to you first, David.
Alexander, I'm happy to answer that question. And what I would say, and I mentioned this earlier in my questions, is we need to focus, and I think it's been echoed by many of us here today, is about deliverability. For context, if we consider the new build heat standard, which our members are now actively delivering, that's delivering the 75% reduction in carbon emissions compared to a 1990s home. They're doing that in the absence of parity regulation in England. the Future Home Standard hasn't come on stream yet, it hasn't been announced. And so we don't yet have the resilient, competitive supply chains that is ensuring that all of our home builders can deliver the air source heat pumps. They're scrabbling around to make sure that they can find the contractors. Now, when you build a new home, it creates 3.5 jobs, £30,000 worth of developed contributions to affordable housing and local authorities, and a share of £3.4 billion worth of GVA. What they are able to do is, when they are building those homes, they're able to invest in their own workforce, they're able to invest in new technologies, and they are testing them out and innovating. We call for a Future Homes Hub because we think that the pathway for further emissions reductions has to be done in collaboration with the sector and government. They have to learn what's working and do it in a way that we can match it with the supply chains. Sometimes some of our members say that building the home can be the easy bit, because if you haven't got the land, you can't build the home. If you haven't got the workers, you can't build the home. And if you haven't got the supply chains, you can't build the home. So there are lessons that can be transferred from the impact of introducing regulation in the new build sector to what we need to do now to tackle retrofit. And it's really that concentration on the supply chains, providing that certainty and ensuring that regulation, the sticks, comes with the carrots and incentives, and that everybody's lining in behind it.
Thank you.
People have indicated, so Jocelyn and then Derek.
Thanks. I'll pick up on two of your points, if that's okay. I think in order, but if I did it in reverse order, I apologise. The first, in terms of ensuring a just transition, I completely take the points in terms of energy pricing reform being out with Scottish Government's jurisdiction, and that there are absolutely things that are within Scottish Government's purview that we should be looking at. I think the one thing that I've sort of taken away from reading this plan, and indeed the heat and building strategy when it first came out, is we cannot ask vulnerable households in Scotland to bridge the gap between incomplete policy making and policy reforms that we wish could happen but are outside of Scottish Government jurisdiction. So I think I really do have concerns in terms of fuel poverty rates and what some of these proposals could do if we're seeing people that are unable to heat their homes sufficiently in terms of damp and mold and health and well-being and that sort of thing. So I think we really need to think comprehensively about, as we've spoken to, and I won't go back into it, funding mechanisms and advice and that sort of thing. But I think that's my primary concern in ensuring a just transition, is not leaving certain households behind and sort of saying, well, we wish policy was different, but it's not right now. So unfortunately, you're going to have to pick up the check for this in terms of either health or cost. In terms of the way that we can ensure that we've got the right people, I agree with David's points entirely. We're not going to make any of this happen if we don't have the people to make it happen. The Scottish Government committed to a skills action plan for, I think it's offshore wind, which I think is wonderful, as highlighted in the climate change plan, to come back, convener, to what's actually in this particular document. It talks about the opportunities, the economic opportunities and good jobs that could come from the proposals herein. I agree entirely. We do have a significant skills gap in my sector and certainly in other sectors across Scotland, health, etc. So I think we also need to be thinking, how are we finding all of these people and training them sufficiently? So one of the things that the CIOB has asked for is the skills action plan for the construction and built environment sector. And I think it really needs to start. We've got decent data, not perfect data, but decent data about the state of the buildings and homes that we do have in Scotland and the amount of homes that we will need in addition. And I think we need to start working backwards from there. Who do we need to build them? What are their skills? Again, I come to all building skills are green building skills if we're going to make the most of the built environment that we have and meet additional demand. So I think we have decent enough data to start mapping out really the people that we need and the skills that they ought to have. And I think we need to work backwards from there in terms of, okay, how do we then get awareness of those particular job roles? How do we get people into training that's functional? It's out with the scope of this committee, but I think it's worth mentioning because it is in the climate plan as well. There are major reforms to education and tertiary education going through Parliament at the moment. Those have a significant impact on apprenticeships in the construction sector. And while they're proposing reform in terms of where funding is allocated and that sort of thing, there is a lot that still needs to be addressed within the apprenticeship delivery system in construction if we're going to meet the climate change plan objectives, the housing emergency objectives, our sort of just transition objectives. And I think, again, it's not necessarily within this committee's scope, but it certainly has an impact on a lot of the policies that are. And I think that's something that we need to be thinking about as well in terms of we have some reform going through Parliament. It doesn't go far enough. The way that we fund apprenticeships for the construction sector and the built environment sector needs fundamental reform. These are costly programs to deliver, but we desperately need the people on the other side that are not only finished their program and can get to work, but in terms of also looking at the building safety, which I know falls within this committee's purview, we need to make sure that they're competent and qualified as well. So I think, and it's not in the climate change plan, but again, in terms of trying to really drill down on the delivery, if we don't address the skills piece, this will not be possible.
Won't happen, yeah.
And so,
Yeah, and I think also there's the kind of like who's going to build it and what are the skills needed, but there's also this piece that has been coming up this morning, but it's been around before, which is the scale. So that kind of who's going to be that person that's going to go into the neighborhood and have that capacity to do project management, but also kind of talking to neighbors and getting everybody on board, and that resistant, nervous person, and right. So there's a relational, human thing that goes along with the project management. That's a skill set that needs to be addressed as well. Derek.
Yes, on the just transition, I think there's two areas of enthusiasm in our network. One is on community wealth building, local strategies and place-making approaches, and really the encouragement of local government to work more closely with trades and local supply chains and think about how they can improve the economies of their local places. There's a huge amount of work here. We've got 34% of our households in fuel poverty, 20% below tolerable standards, 45% disrepair to critical elements. A lot of work for industry in our local places. And second point, I think, is about our members are reporting, so as well as the skills plans that we need, that Jocelyn and others have referred to. Our members have spoken to something more wider and systemic across the historic and built environment skills that we need in our places. Schools, as school children, are they getting a chance to go in and get exposed to these trades, or being encouraged into these as long-term career paths in the same way? Are there college courses, skills, apprenticeships available? Really good example in the Ridge in Dunbar, local project, bring school children in, work with teenagers, apprenticeships, improve historic buildings in the town centre, now taking contracts from the east of Scotland and elsewhere because of the shortages. So there are some opportunities out there, but again, it goes back to cross-policy alignment.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much for that. There's something I was I was contacted by the historic Historic Built Environment Forum. I'm going to mangle that, but they were talking to me about training. So for example, in Highland, how do we get the skills to the young people that are in Highland? And it was a mobile training unit that they raised to me, and we were trying to talk to the government about that. But it's something about that because not everybody's going to be living in the Central Belt and how do you get that skill? And then it's like it's leaving for a day or two, it's overnight accommodation, all that kind of thing. So how do we bring the training actually to where there's enough people that can come together for a day in a place rather than having to come to the Central Belt? Or, as I understand, some of the skills for our retrofitting needs are actually, the training doesn't even exist in Scotland. You have to go further afield. So that definitely needs to be addressed. I wanted to bring in Cornelia.
Yeah. I just wanted to bring in the potentials, or mention the potentials behind the circular economy, or ideas around the circular economy, and just with bringing these bills also together, not just climate change plan, but also the circular economy bill that the Scottish Government already has, emphasize the huge amount of potentials when focusing locally on how resources, capacity, and energy can be exchanged. And community groups have already shown huge, take again the rural perspective, huge advantages in that, in tackling depopulation, right? So depopulation is one of the big issues in the Highlands and Islands. And just by having a wind turbine, they can then invest in the local store that it stays open. They can start an e-bike hiring process and then employ people to run these, and communities to come and buy locally again, and then have maybe locally produced goods suddenly sold. So there is a chain of jobs that can come by just giving a little bit of funding, by promoting a wind turbine and community ownership. And then that brings me to this, to challenge a bit the limited public money narrative, that public investment is inherently constrained and we just don't have this money and we can't invest it. There has been already mentioned the potential, if you invest, how much money you actually get back in terms of other development projects that follow. If you just invest a little bit in infrastructure like a heat network, you suddenly have possibilities for energy, for people to move back, but also to businesses to open up, to give jobs and to create new developments in the region and contribute.
Great. Thank you very much for that. Jan, we're going to go online with Jan.
Yes, I very much welcome the commitment in the draft plan to just transition principles underpinning the whole piece. But we need then again to see that structured around specific actions and commitments. One of the key areas I would like to pick up in terms of ensuring that there are all of those good quality jobs that come to localities, that there is training available to a high standard and so on. And we certainly need it with our building stock, let's be honest. That is about public procurement tools. Now, there is a reference to public procurement tools and aligning those with the climate change plan in the draft. But I think that needs, in the final plan, that needs to be made more specific. So can we be sure that the budget that is devoted, the Scottish Government's budget that goes into the building sector, is aligned with net zero and just transition principles, and is doing that work to make sure that public procurement drives this transition? That needs to be echoed at local government level so that all local governments can be confident that they are using public procurement to best effect in terms of local skills, local supply chains, local housing stock and building development, local businesses. Again, building that kind of circular economy and common wealth that others have referred to. Thank you.
Apologies, I was conferring with the clerk around timings, but so I missed I got your point about public procurement needs to drive the change. Did you mention the community wealth building?
Yes, just to say that reinforces, it's a route to that kind of community wealth building, because if it empowers local authorities to use all of that public procurement, capital as well as revenues, then in support of the net zero buildings or whatever other area of the climate change plan we're talking about, then it's going to help to build that wealth at local level, that community prosperity, and reinforce it.
Thanks very much for that clarification. So there's something there about the plan referring to some other bits of legislation that are working through at the moment, and acknowledging that that's that local procurement being a key pillar of the community wealth building bill. I'm going to go. I don't think anyone else wants to come in on just transition. So Alexander, we're going to EO, and then I'll come back to you, Alexander.
Yeah, just to come back on that kind of the opportunities and the need for front-loading investment. Scottish Government delivered this really good study that showed that energy efficiency and clean heating, if we invested in them, it would deliver around 16,500 jobs by 2030. But that's only if we really see that investment in skills and in workers, as well as the grant and loan schemes for consumers in place in this decade. And if we don't, what we'll see is just pressures and bottlenecks, cliff edges for that delivery that will ultimately make it a lot more expensive for consumers in time and create this two-tier unfair system where those that can afford it the most have access to energy efficiency and clean heating measures, and others are left behind. So we really do need to see a continuation of like full support for fuel poor homes, and also fair funding for those who are able to pay. At WWF, we worked with the Existing Homes Alliance to deliver this analysis on the costs and benefits of the Heat and Buildings Bill, and we focused specifically on minimum energy efficiency standards and what it would be like to deliver that for homeowners. And data showed that it would deliver a 9% cut in energy bills, which is around £260 in current energy prices per annum, and that's huge. And at the same time, that will also have a knock-on impact on reducing climate emissions. So we know we've got the measures, we've got the tools to kind of ensure that households can benefit from these opportunities, and we just need to put them in place to enable that to happen.
Okay, thanks very much for that. And so we've got a bit of a tension here, haven't we, with the conversation about the skills and the needing to train people up, but then the opportunity of 16,500 jobs coming our way by 2030. So, like where somebody said already earlier, where are those people going to come from? But now, Richard, you indicated you want to come back, and then I'll go to you, Alexander.
Apologies for diving in again. I just wanted to pick up. Firstly, yes, absolutely. We're sitting here and it's all doom and gloom, but this is a massive economic opportunity for Scotland in creating high-quality jobs. Within the construction industry, the majority of spend goes on labour, and the labour tends to live quite close to the building sites. So there is that ability to disperse that working throughout the whole of Scotland. But I also wanted to just pick up on the point I made a little bit earlier, which is we spend most of our time in buildings because of the nature of the climate, and the quality of the built environment has huge implications on mental and physical health, on our educational attainment, on our productivity and many other aspects. And all of those are not costed into this process. I think if you actually looked at what is the potential saving to the Scottish NHS of having buildings that don't have damp and are warm and are affordable and heatable, similarly, what's the additional educational attainment that could be factored in? So there are, I think, vast costs out there which are related to the built environment, but are not costed into the analysis of what we're looking at the moment.
So you would maybe like to see an annex or something in the plan that actually looks at that kind of interconnected piece around savings. If you invest here, you're going to save there. Okay, great. Alexander, back to you.
If I can now maybe touch on councils, and maybe Neil, you're maybe the best one to start this one off. Is the impact that we've been seeing of the council's existing local heat and energy efficiency strategies. And I know many councils have put these strategies in place, but it's how we're going to improve the delivery, because once again we have a knock-on effect when it comes to resource and a knock-on effect when it comes to workforce as to how they can be improved and move forward. So maybe if you can start us off, Neil.
Yeah, I mean, from the outset, LHEs as being something that I've been a big advocate of in terms of how we build out an understanding of the landscape in Highlands, and it's looking at very much tying it into our place base, so looking at our local delivery plans so that we've got LHEs embedded into each of those as they're delivered and understanding exactly what that market looks like. But the reality is that LHEs at the moment is a tool that allows us to collect and analyse data. It's not a delivery mechanism, and to put the delivery plan alongside it is really a misnomer in terms, because it's allowing us to identify what a project should look like, but there's no mechanism there to actually drive that forward. And unless we can unlock funding that is related to that, it's very difficult to see how you deliver at that kind of scale using that as a tool set. I mean, I think we've got the mechanism there. The toolkit is good. We just need to align everything else round about that so that the funding and the resources are developed alongside it to be able to deliver it.
Thank you.
Anybody else on LHEs? No? Okay. Just to clarify, when you're saying that it's not a delivery mechanism, and we need to unlock the funding, so is that what would make the delivery happen?
Yeah, I mean,
there's no policy in the way.
No. Yeah. They ask us to produce a delivery plan, but the delivery plan at the moment, we don't have funding to sit alongside that over a 5-year plan.
Right.
So we're trying to guess what that funding's going to look like for year 2, year 3, and it's a continually moving process. Being able to take a plan and deliver it over a 5-year period would allow us to be much more consistent in our delivery, and it provides the opportunity to build that out. I mean, LHEs is not designed just to look at domestic buildings. It's looking at the non-domestic as well, and it's how we start to interact with that. So when we look at heat networks, how that builds into the picture, but you can't do that on a year-by-year funding model.
Certainly. So LHEs is when you're looking at, you said heat networks, so do you have so for Highland, you've got zones, maybe where you're looking at heat network zones in Inverness.
Yeah, I mean, Inverness has been the priority in terms of the work we've done with Scottish Government. We've now, because we've got to a point with the work we've done and they're comfortable with what we're looking at, we're doing a wider scan and trying to understand how you use that mechanism in more rural communities. Because I think if you're looking at driving transition at scale, doing it with individual heat pumps in an area that's heavily constrained in energy is not a realistic option. So we need to understand how we unlock other tools in the toolkit to allow us to do this at scale.
Okay, thanks. Jocelyn.
Sorry, just very quickly to sort of come in and build on Neil's point. I think one of the things the CIOB has asked for as a sort of isolated organisation and as a chair of the retrofit roundtable, so there's about 15 of us that all have agreed on the need for a national retrofit delivery and crucially resource plan. And our sort of vision for that is to give a national sort of central plan and framework to then enable local authorities, housing associations, and the sort of component pieces that sit underneath that plan to then have a multi-year sort of clarity and a resource allocation to deliver it. I'm conscious I think it's in the annex document, it makes reference to the forthcoming heat and buildings delivery plan. Again, I would argue that's much too narrow in scope in terms of, again, we're talking just about the heat and buildings. Giving the Highland Council or housing associations clarity and delivery on one facet of what should be a much wider whole home approach to retrofit is just, again, it's more piecemeal policy making that doesn't then bring down costs, make it so that we can facilitate and actually enable retrofit at scale. So I think we would like to see a centralized piece that then gives agency and autonomy to the players and stakeholders therein with resource and long-term clarity for where they can then put LHE's information to use.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to bring Neil back in because I think that's a direct response, and then I'll bring Jan in.
Yeah, I mean, just to follow up on that, I think in terms of looking at that longer piece of funding, giving that clarity from the public sector allows a much easier route to unlock private sector funding. I mean, what we found with the projects we've delivered over the last 18 months, having that level of public funding that's been allocated to project has allowed us to go out. I mean, the 2 area-based schemes that we've delivered, we've had 6 different funding streams brought into that to be able to deliver it. But we couldn't have done that if there wasn't consistency in the public sector funding to allow us to go out and unlock the rest of it.
Okay, thanks. And Jan?
We're responsible for doing the social side, social research evaluation of the LHE's pilots, and then looking at the development of the guidance on full LHE's requirements. And I think it would be an awful shame to lose the benefit of all of the learning that has taken place over the course of those pilots. Every local authority carried out a pilot at LHE's. Every local authority, I think, has now produced the comprehensive LHE's. That has to be built on. We're working still very slowly at the moment in terms of a few hundred to a few thousand buildings at a time. We need to scale that up to something like 100,000 buildings a year to meet the legal commitment that we've got in place. So one of the critical things is to upskill and resource our local authorities to be able, as we've been talking about, to be able to do that delivery, to implement those strategies, to prioritise, as was the original intention. And that, apart from anything else, we need to see an end to the constantly sort of competition-based funding that goes to local authorities for specific projects that is 1 or 2 years at a time. Many of the local authorities that we interviewed said that the whole process of procurement, of project organisation, of dealing with the building stock and its owners and users took far longer than the average length of competition funding. And what you found was people were employed on a contract until next March, and then you went back to square one. So that constant round of competition is a poor use of resources. It's incurring unnecessarily high transaction costs. We could use the funding more effectively. Multi-year programmes, as others have talked about, and supporting local authorities to lead that delivery in coordination with Scottish Government and specialised units of Scottish Government. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Cornelia.
Just to emphasise on what Jan just said, it is a very big point for councils, this competitive funding, this more short-term rounds. So just also to come back what I said earlier, to have these longer-term, more secure fundings and not building on competition, but collaboration, to be actually able for councils, for people with building, who had built up skills, that they're able to apply that long-term and have the security to work, apply lessons learned, engage with people who are doing similar projects, are on similar learning pathways, and to build a capacity strategically, not just single over projects, but have like an open, transparent data collection platform where people come together, council can come together, community groups can come together to share their experiences and rely or build on those experiences already formed.
Thanks very much. Fulton, I believe you've got some questions around local government as well. Do you feel like it's been covered, or would you still like to come in?
I do feel like it's been covered, convener, but I feel also I should probably come in.
Come on in.
I do feel that there's been a reasonable discussion on it, and I was actually going to give that that preamble to my question. But I guess what my question would be is just asking the panel, and I'll revert back to you to chair it, convener, as I'm obviously not in the room, and it makes it a wee bit awkward in a roundtable format. But I wondered if the panel members had any further thoughts on the direct role of local government in delivering the climate change plan, the draft climate change plan, and more broadly, if they could link that into how they think the capacity and resources of local government, which is obviously well documented in this committee and other forums, how that links into their ability to deliver that. So I know that most people have already touched a wee bit on it in previous answers throughout, but if there's anybody wanting to say anything directly, I'd appreciate that.
Great. Thanks, Fulton. Yeah, so an opportunity for anyone to kind of really put a big highlighter pen through something you want to make sure we hear loud and clear. Derek.
Yeah, it has been well documented. I agree, but its lack of capacity is a massive challenge. There's so many national policies coming out that place obligations on local government, doesn't give them extra resources to achieve them with. Royal Town Planning Institute say that there's been a 30% reduction in planning department spend between 2010 and 2023. At the same time, the unfunded duties have gone up. You can find those trends in other areas. So I think the plan's right to call for lease, to call for local government to take action on their own housing stock, to get involved with collaborations with industry, wider public sector, community-led partnership. But leadership, resources, capacity, that has all got to be there. And I think just adding a few bullet points in a plan say that should be done is great. We'll agree with that, but how do you actually deliver it in practice when everyone's so stretched and statutory duties are arising, and as Neil alluded to, all the funding timescales that you've got to deal with as well.
Great, thanks.
That's my highlighter pen.
Brilliant, good. David.
Thank you. I'd like to echo Derek's points and agree that the well-documented resource issues in local authorities, and they are a barrier and an impact to our home builders, whether they're SMEs delivering in rural areas, a PLC delivering a volume site, or whether it's an RSL. We surveyed our SMEs earlier this year, and actually delays and the speed of processing and planning and consenting is a major barrier and major concern for delivering homes. Now, inevitably, if we want to retrofit existing stock, there is going to be a very clear tension between the desire of delivering those new homes but also achieving climate ambitions to retrofit existing homes under the plan. The government has recently, to step back and give that bigger picture, the government has recently announced its own all 10-year ambition to grow the output of housing by 10% year on year for 3 years. That will require more activity in planning departments, more activity in building standards departments, and there is a need for, yes, more resource, but more resource can also be acquired through being more productive and looking at how those planning departments in particular and building standards are doing more with potentially the same amount of resource they've got, actually making decisions quicker, taking better decisions, and working productively with those who engage with the planning system. You know, for instance, our members will report that they can't get hold of planning officers by telephone. They have to do it by email, and they go to the bottom of the pile. And these types of issues cause massive productivity issues for a home builder, whether it's an RSL or whether it's a private home builder. But there inevitably are aspects of the planning system which could be rationalised in order to be more productive and to create that capacity if we want to do the twin track job of building more homes, but also dealing with the ambitions in the climate change plan.
Okay, thanks. I've got a couple of people who've indicated they want to come in, Jocelyn and then Jan, and then Richard.
Great. Yeah, just to say the CIOB has long championed sort of an enhanced role for local authorities in delivering on retrofit. I think we've spoken before about sort of resource issues, capacity issues, and then clarity as well. So I think what we'd like to see again is an enhanced role for local authorities, but that's underscored and sort of tied into what is a national framework and long-term plan for Scotland writ large. People don't live, work, or travel neatly within local authority boundaries, and I think we need to really be thinking holistically across the sort of national piece for Scotland, but then also giving local authorities the resource, capacity, clarity, and agency that they need to really drive change and be reflective of what are very different local and sort of community contexts. I think we have argued for a long time that local authorities could really meaningfully sort of catalyse change and, as I think Professor Webb indicated earlier, drive supply chains and sort of create some clarity and certainty for the industry if they are anchor stakeholders and sort of leaders on area-based projects and things like that. So I think there's a very real role to play for local authorities, and we think this sort of they should be enabled to respond to what their context and local need is. But again, it needs to fit into that wider piece so we understand and local authorities understand where the resource is going to be long-term and what the plan is for Scotland long-term. And just to sort of tack on another point in terms of local authority challenges in terms of competitive funding, just to say the same experience is coming from the Housing Association background when we did our research there as well. So just to say all stakeholders that are trying to do these retrofit pieces need overhaul to the way that their funding is rolled out.
Okay, thanks very much for that. I've got Jan and then Richard.
Backing up what Jocelyn has just said, and perhaps just extending that slightly by saying, you know, look, all of the cross-sector actors that we work with as researchers emphasise the convening role, is the usual term that's used, of local authorities. And it's certainly very much embedded in the draft plan. But perhaps I would say what's not embedded in there so firmly and needs to be is the resource implications of those further responsibilities, and just recognising that much more centrally and recognising that a lot of the delivery of this plan is going to be in localities, and it is going to be dependent on local governments working in coordination with central government and businesses, and that constant, and communities who are centrally there, that constant coordination is demanding, but it's critical to the performance. So I would like to see much stronger emphasis on the resources being devolved along with the powers and the responsibilities in the final plan. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much for that. Yes, that convening role of local authorities council is very, very important. It seems that's something that's definitely come up in other areas when we've been doing work around this. Richard.
Thank you. Yes, just in terms of local authorities and draft plan itself, already highlighted, I think, around the table the benefit of local authorities having further powers to deal with comprehensive area refurbishments. I would extend that to include the powers to address the 97,000 odd vacant homes that we have in Scotland, which is actually more than 5 times the number of new extra homes that we're completing each year. But I also think that there's a need for the planning and building regulation environment to pivot, in particular with revisions to local development plans to promote the sort of density of development that we talked about before, and in terms of the building standards, the inclusion of consequential improvement, but also the addition of a requirement for post-building completion evaluation and a chain of custody for demolition materials, which would then give the teeth to the local authorities, who obviously have a role in implementing planning policy and the building regulations and technical standards at a local level to ensure that applications coming through meet those requirements.
Okay. that's something to certainly investigate. I just also wonder what your thoughts are on, in terms of that pivot, and I think it came up earlier, we tend to be building homes for maybe 3 and 4 bedroom type size. And certainly at committee we've heard there's a lot of people who are single who desperately need a home. Do we need to also be kind of talking a bit more about that as well?
Yes, I would say so. I mean, I think there's obviously a wide band of housing demand out there, some of which you have to say is consumer-led, which is fair enough. I'm not having a pop at the house builders, but I think you're right. We're seeing increasingly reduced household sizes, and if we are to be responsible for our impact on the built environment, on the environment overall, as a homeowner or as an owner-occupier, you do have to start questioning: do I need a house this big, with a couple of cars in the driveway to get wherever I need to be?
Okay, I'm going to bring David in before I bring Cornelia in, because I think that's in just direct response to that point. So, David, come on.
Certainly, thank you. There is housing demand out there. We surveyed 14,000 members of the public, and it established that 28% of Scots have some form of housing need. So 1 in 4 households. That's massive. It's whether they're homeless or whether they're concealed, they're living in their child bedroom even though they're in their 20s, or simply that some of their homes that they're living in are not fit for their current needs, depending on where they are in life. And inevitably, we will need more homes to be built in order to meet that changing requirements and changing capacity. When you look at the availability of some of the smaller homes, we touched on it earlier on, but it's a question of viability, and a question whether or not the homes can be built with the cost of the current regulation and the cost of materials at a price which can either be sold to a registered social landlord or it can be sold to those who wish to own their own homes. And as a reminder, 80% of the Scots would prefer to own their own homes. So when an assessment is done, there will be a developer will appraise a site and piece of land to assess what's its land value, what the cost of building that home will be, those developer contributions, which I mentioned earlier, so in excess of £30,000 for affordable housing, or paying for the rebuild of schools, but also all the other costs. We've got a building safety levy, which is now being proposed to be introduced. That will add about £3,500 to £4,000 per home. An air source heat pump adds about £8,000 to the cost of homes. So
okay, I'm going to move us on because we're moving a little bit away from the
I just want
plan,
to
and I maybe help do that.
On the cumulative impact of regulation, ultimately, will price some of those smaller homes out of construction or out of the market.
Yep, great. Cornelia.
Briefly return to the highlighting. If the current funding landscapes for local councils remain the same, and the current draft of the climate change plan is indicating that, then it will put just further burdens on local councils. And local councils should be rejuvenated by the whole climate change plan, and because they are the ones more local, they know they can do place-based delivery plans, be strategic in their areas, and build more closer ties to communities to bring them on board to the transition. So there's, of course, the essential need of local governmental sectors to play a role, but they also need to get the capacity and to be able to do and play that role efficiently.
Okay, thanks very much. So we've gone over time. I'm going to keep us going rather than take a break, so apologies for that. I'm going to bring in Mark Griffin. He's got a couple of questions, and I've got a final wrap-up question. So we may go about 20 minutes longer, so I hope that's okay. Mark.
Yep, thank you, Minna. Good morning, everyone. So we touched briefly in some of the earlier discussions about the economic benefit and to some of the changes that we would hope to see attached with the climate change plan. But I just wanted to talk about community benefits and how we ensure that local communities are benefiting from investment in infrastructure, investment in community electricity generation, or potentially the introduction of things like heat networks. How do we ensure that communities are benefiting from those developments rather than potentially corporations simply extracting wealth from communities, but that tension that exists with needing private investment really drive some of that investment. So open that up. I don't know if I come to Cornelia first, and you did talk briefly about community benefits as well.
Yes, happy to. Thanks. It's a big topic again in itself, so I try to be short. But yeah, when it comes to the rollout of just transition infrastructure, like the transmission network, the big pylons that are now built across Scotland, it's of course or begs the question, what do Scottish rural communities and fuel poverty get out of that? If just more renewable energy is removed from where they can access it and it's still not affordable, still not available to them, then it is hard to be supportive about it, right? And I don't like often the framing is around NIMBY, like not in my backyard attitudes. It's not as simple as that most of the times. And so community benefits could be that companies who have a large-scale wind farm planned and put in operation pay certain amounts to communities who are in the vicinity. But I think there, again, needs to be a much more focused, structured, and stronger emphasis on what role the communities play in the design or in the planning and in the ownership of these energy futures. So to be part of it and not just receiving a passive income additionally to what their daily life is about anyway. So shared ownership is very important, and it has not been uptaken because the potentials are not there yet and the capacities are not there yet. And community ownership itself, I have mentioned it before, has been very promising, but it has been inviable in recent years because the feed-in tariff scheme that supported all of that has ended in 2019, and CARES is not pulling the weight. It can't make up for that. So instead of just putting a solar panel on a local school, it could be 1 to 3 larger turbines that then create very substantial income for communities that they then can decide for themselves how we use that. Or just having for every 10th wind turbine installed, 1 turbine in community ownership to have this shared ownership, not just in the physical sense like we own this, but also in a sense of we have been part of this and we designed and own this in more moral and theoretical senses.
And in a way that comes back to what Jan was saying right at the beginning, that it's not just about being consumers, but being engaged citizens who are kind of playing a part in our transition to net zero. So, Richard, I think you wanted to come in.
Just very quick point, as a point of example, is some of the community buyouts that we've seen in the islands. I'm thinking particularly of the Isle of Gir, where over a period of time they've been able to invest in improving the existing housing stock and adding new housing, bringing more people back onto the island, creating more businesses on the island, more children in the school, that sort of thing. So it's possible to create that virtuous circle.
Yeah, certainly. And we were hearing at the Spice Breakfast last week from I think someone from a community heat network project, and that had been funded. And I thought this was really powerful. It was kind of like taking community benefit from renewable energy to the next level, where a development trust in the Lammermuir area funded a feasibility study for community ownership and community networks, heat networks and things. And I thought, yeah, that's the kind of where we need to be going with that money, and then that links, and then that goes into there's the housing and all those kinds of things. Neil.
Yeah, the Highland Council have launched the Social Value Charter, and it's around how we capture some of that benefits from the development that's going on in the region. I think the community benefit and the structure it's in at the moment in a region like Highland isn't equitable. I think we've got a vast number of communities that don't get any benefit, and other communities that are getting increasingly larger sums of community benefits. And they've got their own challenges, because the communities that are continuing to grow that funding are getting to the point they don't know how to manage that either. And I think there needs to be an element of support brought into the communities to understand how you use that effectively. And the social value chart starts to set that out. It's looking at how we can engage with developers and businesses in the region, that we can structure how they can support. So it's not just looking at where they feed in community benefit, it's what the additionality to that is and where they can support the communities. And equally the communities, I think one of the big areas that we're looking at is shared ownership. I think that long term, if you're looking at a sustainable means of supporting communities at the scale of a region of Highlands, it's through shared ownership. But the model for shared ownership needs to be at a scale that makes that viable. And that's where it's always been difficult. I think there's always been an element of shared ownership available to communities, but the scale that developers are talking about and what communities can actually afford to invest or to achieve in terms of funding is, there's quite a gap between the two at the moment. I think there's an opportunity to change that.
Yeah, and maybe that's something that the Scottish National Investment Bank, for example, could get involved in helping that out. But I also talking to communities about that kind of community ownership piece. What I've heard is that they'll negotiate with one company and then another, and they have to kind of learn a different language for that in each of those negotiations. And what would be great to see is something where actually the developers need to use a community language, that so communities don't have to keep relearning. I'm going to come back to Mark. I think you've got a final question.
Yep. My final question was just on the level of engagement with government when it comes to development of the climate change plan now. Obviously, this is parliamentary engagement. It's really helpful to support us in our scrutiny work, but just to ask what sort of engagement you have had with the government in the actual design of the plan, rather than responding to it as we are now, so to speak.
Who wants to pick that up? Anyway, David.
I have to say that we have engaged with Scottish Government across a number of work streams, so particularly the Scottish equivalent to Passive House. It's an area where we've been able to table our industry alternative, which proposes a solution which would reduce carbon emissions from future homes by 95% after the introduction of the new build heat standards. We've also tabled our proposal for a Scottish Future Homes Hub, but on the climate change plan itself, we've not had any engagement.
Okay. Jocelyn.
I think in a similar way, we've not had any direct engagement on the climate change plan, but I think there is sort of a wider challenge around industry engagement on what is quite a crowded policy environment for what I would argue, and I think hopefully others will agree, is quite an integral sector to reaching quite a lot of Scottish Government objectives. But just to sort of add a caveat to that, I also think there's maybe a lack of joined-upness or cross-collaboration within the different work streams that Scottish Government which would equally, I think, deliver on better policy making. So we'd love to speak more directly with government, but I think we would also love to see a little bit more cross-working within government in terms of delivering better policy outcomes for us all.
Okay. I'm just going to add, I'm going to embellish Mark's question a little bit and ask, so the level of engagement you've had, but also the process from your perspective of developing the plan, like consultations and things from your awareness, and also the timing of the scrutiny. So we've been waiting a while for this and quite close to the end of a session, so we can add in those bits as well. I'm going to go to EO.
So as Stop Climate Chaos and WWF Scotland, we've had some engagement so far with the Scottish Government as part of their stakeholder workshops, but spaces for that are limited. So David and Jocelyn, for example, were invited in that, but obviously there should have been space for all of us to feed in. And even if you did make it to those workshops, there wasn't that much of an opportunity to co-develop or think together with civil servants about what would be an ambitious but deliverable policy. So that aspect of it was lacking, and it would have been great if we could have had more participation from stakeholders all across industry and third sector, workers themselves, individuals, consumers, throughout that process to actually deliver something that on the onset is a lot more clear and has the timelines and the things that would be necessary to actually deliver the plan as we would have liked to see. And forgive me, I forgot the second part of
just on the timing of this scrutiny.
Yeah, and we're coming round to the end of the parliamentary session, which I think it's why we're seeing this backloading of investment to the second carbon budget. So a brief analysis of that would be that government is kind of delaying the really hard and difficult choices and the multi-year funding, the Scottish budget alignment and interconnectedness that we want to see to the next government. So, yeah, that's...
Thanks. Alistair.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what's already been said. I mean, Consumer Scotland has been engaging with a wide range of teams across the Scottish Government on a lot of the different component elements that form part of the climate change plan. I think I think part of the challenge of it is that it's come at such a stage in the time of the kind of term of the Parliament that it's a lot harder to get that engagement and that broader input that's probably required to really give it proper scrutiny. I think Jocelyn made a really good point just about just the interconnectedness across Scottish Government, and I think there's definitely some bit more work that can be done to bring all these kind of disparate parts together into a coherent plan.
Thanks. Anybody else? Richard.
Just very quickly to say, and I'm not best placed to answer the direct question in terms of our involvement with the draft plan. I'm a volunteer with the RAS, and I've had involvement with the Building Standards Division EPC reform, Scottish equivalent to Passive House. Other colleagues will have been involved in planning and MP4, etc. But the person who could really answer that is actually sitting over there. But I hope that we have responded whenever we've been asked, and are always very willing to give our opinions.
Okay, great. Anybody else want to comment on the consultation engagement and timings? No? Okay, brilliant. Well, it's been a really great morning. Really good to hear your thoughts on the draft climate change plan and the building chapter. That's going to really help our scrutiny of the plan. And I'm now going to briefly suspend to allow you all to get your coats and leave and go out into the gloomy day. Thanks very much for joining us. We now turn to agenda item 3, which is the formal consideration of 2 negative instruments. The first is Title Conditions Scotland Act 2003 Rural Housing Bodies Amendment Order 2025 SSI 2025/298. Do members have any comments on the instrument? We don't have any comments. Is the committee agreed that we do not wish to make any recommendations in relation to the instrument? We're agreed. Thank you. The second negative instrument is for consideration today is the Building Scotland Amendment Regulations 2025 SSI 2025/312. Do any members have any comments on this instrument? I do. I can. So the comment I'd like to make is that we received some short notice information on the instrument, 2 letters, that I think it would be good for us to take the time to consider and potentially write to the Scottish Government on the back of that correspondence. Are we agreed? We're agreed. Thank you. And we previously agreed to take the next item on our agenda in private. So that concludes the public part of the meeting, and we will move into private.